Goodbye, Jake. Mornings should never bring bad news. Ask anyone, and they'd agree if there's grief to be delivered. Better leave it for the night, when the world is quiet and darkness makes sense of fear. But the Wetterling considered herself lucky. October 22, 1989, had started like any other mild autumn day in Long Prairie, Minnesota. The kind of day with messy, happy chaos, kids laughing, leaves crunching underfoot, and sticky fingerprints of cherry jam across the kitchen table. Her daughter Carmen had ruined another tablecloth. Jake, her oldest son, came in with grass-stained knees. Trevor, the youngest, had picked at his scabs again. These, Patty thought, were the worst things they'd faced that day. Maybe, had the day ended differently, she would have remembered it for Jerry's good mood after a successful deal at work. Maybe they'd have gone to sleep with the comforting heaviness of her signature meatloaf in their bellies. Maybe it would have been just another day. But not far from their home, a man named Danny Heinrich was already sliding behind the wheel of his car. In the glove box, an unloaded revolver. In his jacket pocket, a nylon stocking. He turned onto Country Road 75 with a chilling stillness, the kind only a man with dark plans can manage. Back in the kitchen, Patty was preparing dinner, arranging plates, drizzling oil over salad greens. It was nearing 7 p.m., and her nerves began to fray. Jake and Trevor weren't home yet. They'll be back any minute. Jerry reassured her from the couch, nose buried in Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, a choice of reading she'd never quite understood. You always take things too personally, Jerry told her. He also believed fear needed a tangible reason, something flesh and bone. Everything else, he said, was just empty space between molecules. So that evening, an hour before dinner, he poured a cold bucket of rationality over her anxious heart. They'll be fine, sweetheart. They're just down the road. Jake and Trevor were already on their bikes, waiting politely for the go-ahead. Okay. Patty finally relented with a smile. But straight there and back, the boys were trading their worn-out DuckTales VHS for something new. Their friend Aaron Ari Larson was waiting to join. The three were nearly inseparable, like stair-step brothers who stayed up too late and laughed too loud. "Good evening, Mrs. Wetterling," Ari shouted cheerfully. "Evening, Mr. Wetterling." "Straight there and back," Patty called out again as the blonde crown of Jake's head disappeared behind a neighbor's fence. The meatloaf kept cooking, and Patty watched the road with mounting unease. Not because of a mother's sixth sense, just because she was a mom waiting for her sons to come home for dinner. And then she saw them, two small figures running across the lawn. She smiled, started to turn away but froze. They were running. Fast. "Jerry," she called out. It wasn't like her boys to abandon their bikes. "Jerry!" Patty screamed again as she saw one of the boys wasn't hers. She flung the door open, nearly knocking down little Carmen, who'd come running at the sound of her mother's panic. "Mom!" Trevor was gasping, stumbling like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Ari followed, pale and breathless. "Trevor, what happened?" Patty looked at their faces. No tears. For a split second, she relaxed. But only for a second. "Mom!" Trevor cried again and collapsed. And then she saw why there were no tears. They weren't crying. They were paralyzed with terror. "He took Jake, Mom! He took him!" Choosing the movie took longer than usual. Trevor wanted to rent Scooby-Doo for the 100th time. Jake was lobbying for something about time travel, and Ari, ever the rebel, insisted they finally get Die Hard. But the clerk refused to let three kids rent a Bruce Willis action flick, and Back to the Future 2 wouldn't be out until December. So they settled for Scooby-Doo and the 13 Ghosts, and pedaled off into the evening. The wind was barely noticeable, but Jake, riding ahead, felt the bite of the autumn air creeping under his jacket. He released one hand from the handlebars to fasten the top button. Silently, he thanked his mom for insisting he wear something warmer, even if he would have preferred to show off his custom t-shirt until the snow came. "You coming over?" Jake asked when Ari caught up to him. They were halfway home. It was time to decide whether to swing by Dale Street to drop Ari off or ride straight to the Wetterlings. Not sure, Ari shrugged. I didn't tell my mom. He motioned toward Trevor, who was now far ahead, pedaling hard. I'm not watching Scooby-Doo again! Ari shouted after him. It's not my fault you're too young for Die Hard, Trevor yelled back over his shoulder. Jake laughed. They all laughed, not knowing it might be the last time. All right, Ari threw up his hands. Fine, I'll watch your dumb dog show. He leaned forward and started pedaling faster, overtaking Jake with a grin. Up ahead, he said something to Trevor, but Jake couldn't hear the words over the rising noise behind him. A low rumble, a car. He turned his head. A blue Ford was speeding up behind them. Hey, Jake called out. Car! Trevor, Ari, move over! The boys veered toward the side of the road, forming a line to let the car pass. But instead of passing, it braked hard, skidded sideways, and blocked their path. Watch out, Jake shouted. Trevor was closest. He had to jump off his bike, nearly dropping it. Ari stopped right behind him. What's he doing? Trevor asked. But there was no time for guesses, no time for fear, no time to run. Stop right there. The voice came from the driver's side of the car, hidden from view. Deep, commanding. It froze the boys where they stood. Don't move! They hadn't even seen who was speaking yet. Then a figure stepped out from behind the car. The man wore a black nylon stocking over his face. The fabric stretched tightly over his forehead and cheekbones, distorting his features. His nose bent to one side, pressed flat under the material. The eyes, barely visible, floated like dark pits behind a smoky veil. Throw the bikes into the ditch, the man ordered, calm but cold. Jake gripped his handlebars tighter, frozen in place. His eyes locked on the stranger's face beyond that warped, ghostly mask. He didn't notice at first the reason they should comply. Now! The man barked, raising his hand. A silver revolver flashed in the fading light. Jake, Trevor whispered. He wanted to ask what to do, but the man didn't wait. I said, ditch the bikes, or I'll blow your heads off. Jake looked from Trevor to Ari, his pulse pounding. Then, slowly, he nodded. With a heavy breath, he wheeled his bike toward the roadside. Dry grass crunched beneath the tires. Throw them, the man repeated. The ditch wasn't deep. Jake figured they'd be able to pull the bikes out later if there was a later. Jake? Trevor's voice trembled. Do it, Jake said. Trevor looked so small in that moment. Just a year younger, but suddenly it felt like a lifetime. Jake felt it, the weight of being an older brother, the need to protect. Throw it, Trevor, he whispered again. He pushed his own bike down the slope. It toppled, rolled, and landed with a hollow thud. Seconds later, Trevor's green bike and Ari's red one followed. Down. Face to the ground, the man said. He moved toward them, waving the gun at each of them one by one. Down, now! Jake sank to his knees. Hands forward, palms to the dirt, chest down. He tried not to let his face touch the prickly grass. Beside him, Ari dropped too. Their eyes met for a second. Ari was crying now. Silent tears rolled sideways down his cheeks, gathering at the bridge of his nose before falling. Do you see that tree line? The man asked. Trevor stood trembling, tiny sneakers shifting in the dirt. His eyes flicked toward the field behind them. A stretch of dry grass sloped downward, ending in a thick patch of woods. Yes, Trevor whimpered. Run to it, the man ordered. And don't look back. If you turn around, I'll shoot you. Trevor sniffled. His voice broke as he answered, Okay. Jake couldn't lift his head, couldn't see his brother, couldn't even shout run. Fear had wrapped itself around his throat like wire. Go, the man barked. Trevor's footsteps began immediately, light, frantic, desperate. Jake held his breath as he listened. Don't look back, the man roared again. Jake slammed his eyes shut, clutched fistfuls of grass and dirt in his hands. His chest burned from holding everything inside. Please don't shoot, the gun didn't fire. Instead, Jake heard the crunch of boots moving again closer. Then, they stopped. The barrel of the gun now hovered above him. You too, the man said. Jake flinched, but the voice wasn't directed at him. Ari, The boots shifted. Jake peeked to the side. Up, now, the man said again. Ari scrambled to his knees. The masked man raised the gun. Same deal. Run after your friend. Don't stop. Don't turn around, or I'll shoot. Ari didn't hesitate. He met Jake's eyes for a single terrible second, then looked away. His legs kicked into motion, and he sprinted into the field, hot on Trevor's trail. Jake remained alone on the roadside, the ditch behind him now silent. The man exhaled loudly through the mask. Jake was still lying face down, dirt in his nose, tears soaking into his collar. He didn't know what to expect next, but he was sure of one thing now. He was the one who wasn't running. He was the one who was staying. Jake didn't dare lift his head. The world around him had gone hollow, like all the air had been sucked out of it. Every breath scraped his throat. His chest ached. The man said nothing for several seconds, just stood behind him, breathing. Then, hands behind your back. Jake's muscles locked. He didn't move. I said, hands behind your back? Still nothing. His legs were trembling, pressed against the earth. Then, a sharp tug. The man grabbed his wrist, yanked his arm backward. Something cold and smooth wrapped around it. Click. A handcuff. Jake gasped. I want to go home, he said softly. He turned his head slightly, trying to see the man's face beneath the stocking. The shadows made it look like a faceless ghost. Please, he whimpered. For a moment, just one, the man hesitated. Jake could feel it. That split second of silence. Maybe doubt, maybe guilt. Please, I want to go home. I want my mom, please. The man didn't speak. He locked the second cuff with a loud snap, then hauled Jake up by the shoulders. Jake stumbled. Let me go, he shouted now, louder, braver, but not strong enough. The man didn't respond. Just shoved him forward, back toward the blue Ford. Jake dragged his feet, resisting. No, I want to go home. They reached the car. The metal of the door was ice cold against his cheek as the man pushed him in. Jake turned to him one last time. What did I do wrong? He asked. The man didn't answer. He closed the door, started the engine, pulled away from the ditch, and turned not toward home but away, into the dark. The engine rumbled low beneath Jake's feet. The road stretched out in front of them, empty and endless. There were no headlights behind them, no brake lights ahead, just darkness. He sat in the back seat, wrists locked together in metal cuffs. Tears streamed silently down his face. Fields passed by in smudges of yellow and brown. Telephone poles flickered in and out of sight like the ticking of a slow, terrible clock. Jake pressed his cheek against the cold window. He could still see the ditch. The place where his bike had fallen, where Trevor had run, where Ari had turned and disappeared. He should have run too. He should have fought harder. The man said nothing. From behind, Jake could see only part of him, the back of a thick head of dark hair, a coat collar, one hand on the steering wheel. Jake didn't want to see his face anymore. He wanted to forget it. He closed his eyes, breathed in shallow gasps. The seatbelt was still buckled next to him, as if that mattered. As if the real danger had anything to do with a crash. They passed a road sign. Jake tried to remember the name. He whispered it to himself. Then another turn, right, left, left again. He repeated it like a rhyme. Right, left, right. But eventually, there were too many turns, too many dark stretches, and the rhyme fell apart. He gave up. The car swerved slightly, then slowed. They were leaving the road. The Ford rumbled over dry grass, descending a gentle slope into a dark, open field. Trees loomed far ahead, black against the moonless sky. Jake looked around desperately. No houses, no lights, just stars and wind and silence. The car rolled to a stop near a patch of trees. Jake's heart was beating so loudly he thought the man might hear it. The door opened. Out, the man said flatly. Jake didn't move. He didn't want to know what came next. Get out. Jake didn't move. The door was open. The cold night air rushed into the car, carrying the dry scent of grass and something else, damp earth. Old wood. Distance. The man reached in and yanked him by the arm. Jake's feet hit the ground. His knees buckled. He staggered. The handcuffs clinked softly as he tried to steady himself. "I want to go home," Jake whispered. The man didn't respond. He shoved Jake forward toward the dark line of trees. Jake tried to dig his heels into the ground, but it only made the man push harder. "Move." The boy stumbled across the uneven grass. The forest ahead seemed alive. Black branches clawing at the sky, hiding everything within. Jake's breathing turned sharp and ragged. Behind him, the car doors slammed shut. The silence that followed was terrifying. He wanted to scream, wanted to run, but the revolver was pressed into his back now. Every time he hesitated, the man nudged it harder against his spine. "Please," Jake said again, his voice almost gone. A pause, then came a short answer. "No." They reached the trees. The man's breath had turned heavy, sharp and quick. His steps were slower, now not from doubt, but exertion. Jake looked back once, just for a second. The field behind them had vanished. The car looked distant, unreal, like a toy left behind in a terrible dream. The man stopped. Jake's heart dropped into his stomach. "Take off your clothes," the man said. Jake blinked. He didn't understand at first. Couldn't understand. "What?" Now, the boy shook his head violently, backing away. The man raised the gun again. "Take off your clothes." Jake froze. His breath caught in his throat like a fishhook. The words echoed through the trees, unnatural, like they didn't belong to this world or to this man. I don't want to," Jake said. The masked figure took one step closer. "I said now." Jake shook his head, stepping back until he hit the rough bark of a tree. The revolver rose again, steady and silent. Jake's lips trembled. "Please, don't." The man's voice dropped, almost soft, but it made it worse. "Do it, or I'll do it for you." Jake stood there, trembling, cold, tears slipping quietly from his eyes. The wind made the leaves hiss all around him like 1,000 whispers. None of them would save him, no one would. He could barely breathe. His heart was beating so fast it hurt. His legs felt like paper. Every instinct screamed run, but his body didn't move. He didn't know how much time passed. Maybe a minute, maybe eternity. Eventually, the woods fell silent. And then came the sound, the dry snap of denim, a shirt shifting, a sob swallowed down like poison. The masked man said nothing else, only moved. And in that dark forest, beneath a sky that saw everything, a child's life broke open. What happened next would never be fully spoken aloud. Not by the police, not by the man who did it, and certainly not by Jake. Because Jake would never come home. Jake was kneeling now, not by choice. His legs had given out, and he'd fallen the way a branch snaps when bent too far. The forest around him was dead quiet. Even the wind had stopped. He could feel the barrel of the revolver touch the back of his neck. The metal was cold, but not as cold as the absence of noise, of mercy, of any voice saying stop. He stared at the ground, dirt and dead leaves. One small root curled like a question mark in the soil. And he thought of home, of the way the kitchen smelled when Mom made meatloaf, of Trevor's dumb jokes, of how Ari had looked when he turned to run, of the warm light in the living room, of being safe. A whisper escaped him. "Please." Click. A pause. The gun had jammed. For a second, Jake lifted his head, blinking. Could it be? Then the sound came again. Click. Bang. And another bang. Then silence. Real silence. The kind you don't come back from. The man stood for a moment over what remained, then turned, left the woods the way he came, as if nothing had happened at all. "Jerry?" Patty's voice cracked through the air like lightning. He had barely turned the page of his book when he heard it first quiet, then sharp and rising. By the second time she called, it was a scream. He sighed, closed the book. What now? Calmly, too calmly, he stood from his chair and made his way to the stairs. One hand in his pocket, the other trailing along the banister. He didn't rush, Jerry was a numbers man. Always had been. He liked things that could be measured, understood, graphed. Statistically speaking, he often began, followed by percentages and odds designed to keep panic at bay. He opened the door, and the numbers collapsed. Trevor was on the ground. Ari stood nearby, looking like a ghost, colorless, breathless, shaking. And Patty was standing there, not moving, staring at their son like she didn't recognize him. "He took him!" Trevor screamed, voice cracking. "He took Jake!" A man? He had a gun? He had a mask? Jerry's heart slammed in his chest. No, no, no. He ran to his son, dropping to his knees, grabbed Trevor by the shoulders, maybe too hard. "What do you mean? Who took him? What man?" Trevor sobbed so hard he couldn't speak. Ari, pale as moonlight, finally answered, "He had a gun. He said if we didn't run, he'd shoot us. He let us go. But he kept Jake." And just like that, the world fell away beneath Jerry's feet. The police were called within minutes. Jerry could barely form the words when he dialed. His voice cracked mid-sentence. "A man took our son." He gave the address. The dispatcher asked if they were sure it was a kidnapping. Patty took the phone from him and screamed, "He had a gun! He took Jake! What more do you need?" They didn't eat that night. The meatloaf stayed in the oven until the smell of it burning became unbearable. Patty didn't notice. She sat on the edge of the couch, rocking slightly, whispering Jake's name under her breath, like a prayer or a spell. Jerry paced, first through the kitchen, then to the hallway, then to the living room window, where he stood and watched for flashing lights. They came, but not fast enough. 2 officers arrived just after 8 p.m., followed by more cars, more uniforms, more lights. None of them brought Jake. The night stretched long. Neighbors gathered outside with flashlights. Volunteers were called. Helicopters would come later, but not that night. That night was made of silence, sobbing, and questions no one could answer. Patty didn't go upstairs. She couldn't walk past Jake's room. Jerry stayed near the door, as if Jake might still walk through it, as if the boy who'd left on a bike at dusk might return by dawn. The next morning, the town changed. It wasn't just the houses and streets, or the woods now crawling with flashlights and boots. It was the air. Everything felt thinner, too quiet. By dawn, dozens of people were out in the fields. Neighbors, teachers, mail carriers, teenagers with backpacks and tired eyes. They combed the grass with sticks, peered under leaves, called Jake's name like it might echo back from wherever he'd gone. Dogs barked. Radios crackled. Helicopters chopped the sky. And still no Jake. Jerry stood just beyond the search line, gripping a photo of his son in both hands. It was one of the good ones. Jake smiling, hair messy, missing tooth visible. He held it out to the officers. 11 years old. Blue jacket. Bike with a silver stripe. They nodded. Took the photo. Promised to do everything they could. But it wasn't enough. Patty stayed home. She couldn't face the open air, the possibility of hearing his name on someone else's lips, someone who didn't love him. So she stayed in the house, pacing between the front window and the kitchen table. She hadn't slept. Neither had Jerry. But tired didn't matter now. They had to find Jake. Had to believe he was still out there, still breathing, still waiting to come home. By the 3rd day, Jerry was done waiting. He walked into the police station before the sun had fully risen. No appointment, no permission, just rage. An officer met him at the front desk, blinking in surprise. "I need to speak to someone in charge." They brought him to a back room, offered coffee. He didn't sit. "This is moving too slow," Jerry said. "You're wasting time." The detective across from him was calm. Too calm. "We're doing everything we can." "You're not," Jerry snapped. "You're treating this like a runaway." "He didn't run away. A man with a gun took my son." The officer stayed quiet. Jerry slammed a hand on the table. "You need to look at known offenders, anyone with a history. Especially with kids." The detective frowned. "That's not as easy as it sounds. You're telling me you don't keep track of them?" Jerry leaned forward, voice sharp. You don't know where the people are who've done this before? The silence said everything. No, the officer admitted. We're not allowed to require that kind of registration. It's not the law. Jerry felt the blood drain from his face. So someone like that, someone dangerous, could be living down the street from my kids and I wouldn't know? The detective nodded, slow and quiet. That's correct. Jerry sat back, stunned. Then the law is broken. The house was dark, except for the kitchen. A small light glowed above the stove. Jerry sat at the table, hunched over a mess of papers, maps, names, old news clippings. A photo of Jake lay in the center, crumpled at the corners from being handled too much. He rubbed his face with both hands. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. Patty stood nearby in her robe, arms folded tightly across her chest. He could still be alive, she whispered. Jerry didn't answer. Do you believe that? She asked again. He raised his eyes, red, glassy, haunted. I want to. She took a slow step toward him. I don't want to live in a world where he's not. Jerry nodded barely. Patty's voice broke. But if he's not, then we have to do something. Jerry looked at the table again, at the gaps in the law, at the places the system refused to go. Someone out there knows something, he said. And someone else like this will do it again. They stood in silence for a long time. Then Patty said quietly, Then we have to change everything. And that was the moment it began. Not the grieving that had already taken root, not the search that was still ongoing, but the fight. The fight to make sure Jake wouldn't just be a face on a poster. We never stopped waiting. Not on the first night, when every creak in the house felt like footsteps. Not after the search teams went home. Not after the news moved on. We waited not because we believed time owed us a miracle, but because love doesn't end when a person disappears. It just learns to exist in silence, in memory, in action. Jake never came home, but his name never stopped moving, and neither did we.